No, it's better to start.
Okay.
And then we'll save time.
I don't know if I'll stand or sit. Stand. Hello. My name is John Paul Dowling. I'm the head of Department of Visual Communication at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. I just started in that position a couple of months ago. Prior to that, I worked for 10 years in the UK at the University of the West of England in Bristol. Along with that role, I'm also Education Director of the International Society of Typographic Designers. So I'm kept busy. I suppose a disclaimer before I start, and speaking at a kind of educational focused part of the conference, I did last night what we all tell our students not to do. I didn't back up my presentation. I lost my entire presentation. So I've been up since very early this morning trying to pull everything back together. So there's a little bit of winging it in this. So the title of this is Design Culture and Reality, and just even for myself, as a recap, I'm just going to kind of fly through the abstract. So the educational model or lack of for teaching design, and speaking about graphic design, often leads to a speculative approach that seeks to represent the realities of working in industry. Hypothetical situations are introduced to mimic real-life briefs, but there's nothing real about this approach. Students are in a situation where they cannot test their work. There is no audience, no client, and no user. Therefore, learning is limited to opinion and taste. Increasingly, students are drawn to work that does not align itself to commerciality in the traditional sense, but work that impacts on culture, social and societal levels, work that improves people's lives, if only marginal, has more moral capital. Typography is both fundamental and universal to mass knowledge consumption. There is no class divide, no economic margin, no racial partition, no division based on faith or creed. It is true typography that we access the written word, and it is true typography that we give our students a voice. And this last kind of statement is really, that last part is really true to me in how I teach. So this paper, or rant, seeks to challenge and inform, to make friends and maybe enemies, in the hope that by raising questions rather than giving answers, we as educators can address how and why we teach design, along with the moral obligations that come with it. So I'm going to kind of focus on the three separate words that are in the title, design, culture and reality. So starting with design, and I'm speaking about graphic design. I suppose it was highlighted to me more when I moved back to Dublin recently that I'm now teaching on a visual communication course, not a graphic design course. And I have people ask me what's the difference. The thing is, I studied visual communication. I have a degree in visual communication, although I've never referred to myself as a visual communicator. And I have yet to meet a visual communicator. I've met many graphic designers. And going on from this, I'm seeing courses now that are called graphic communication, or communication arts, or graphic communication design, or graphic and communication design, or graphic communication and illustration. And then you start putting digital into the mix, interaction, web, human-centered service, responsive. People, I think we have an identity crisis. There seems to be this kind of pulling and dragging of our subject area to try and reframe it or rename it, to try and recategorize what it is. And from my experience of working in education, it seems to be led by industry or led by what's deemed as what's kind of hot now in design, or what way we should be moving towards to kind of refocus how we teach students. If we look at even just the Wikipedia version of what graphic design is, which you'll have teenagers looking at if they're making decisions on what they want to study, it's a very basic kind of explanation of what our area is, that it's the process of visual communication and problem solving through the use of typography, space, image and color. So what happens if we teach using sound or smell or touch? Is that not graphic design? And it's certainly not visual, so it couldn't be visual communication. So where does it sit? While graphic design as a discipline is relatively recent in history, the term itself was originated in 1922. If we look up the The Oxford English Dictionary, and this is, as of 2016, as of this morning, it says that, graphic design in that context is relating to visual art, especially involving drawing, engraving, and lettering. Now, again, I don't have a problem with that, but that's back to 1922 when the term was originated, when actually the second adjective, giving clear and vividly explicit details, to me seems much more appropriate of what graphic design is now today. To go on from this, the Encyclopedia of Britannia calls graphic design the evolution, or says about graphic design, the evolution of graphic design as a practice and profession has been closely bound to technology, our technological innovations, societal needs, and the visual imagination of practitioners. And this, I think, for me, is getting much closer. We are aligned to technical innovations. We should be focused on societal needs. It is about imagination, and it is about the practitioners of the craft. So when talking about all of this, how do we teach design? How do you teach all those things in a kind of functional or in a formatted way? Milton Glaser said that there are 3 responses to a piece of design: yes, no, and wow. And wow is the one that he aims for. So how do you teach wow? To go on from that, Debbie Millman, in her book, How to Think Like a Graphic Designer, says that design is one of the few disciplines that is a science as well as an art. Effective, meaningful design requires intellectual, rational rigor along with the ability to elicit emotions and beliefs. Thus, designers must balance both the logic and the lyricism of humanity every time they design something, a task that requires a singularly mysterious skill. And again, the word mysterious is back in there, which kind of lumps in with wow. How do you teach mysterious? And again, but there's some very good points in this, very good words in this that you can pull from, whether it's science or art: effective, meaningful, intellectual, rational, rigor, emotive, beliefs, logic, lyricism, humanity, and skill. But there is no template. There is nothing you can turn to tell you how to teach design. There is no real template that's, whether if we were teaching accounting or something that's very straightforward, A plus B equals C, we don't have anything there. Certainly new people into design education, there is no template there to show you and tell you how to teach design. It's a way of either you kind of sit into the design model of the institution that you work in, or you start to rewrite this model for yourself. When we talk about culture, and for me culture is one of the most important aspects of design and how we teach design, but a very basic kind of almost dictionary definition of culture is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. So there's almost an understanding that we all have to decide that something is cultural. It cannot exist and be cultural on its own. An example of this when explaining culture to my students, as I use culture vastly throughout how I teach, I give them is the music industry. So I explain to them that in the music industry we have a baseline of what's perceived as culture, and when we think about my earlier description of culture, that it's regarded by everyone, I tell them that the baseline in the music industry unfortunately is pop music, and this is the music that's mass consumed at its lowest common denominator. And underneath that, or the underbelly of pop music, or the underground, is independent music. And every now and again independent music spikes through and breaks through what is the norm and what is the boring level or baseline of culture and pop music. And an example of this would be in the early noughties was a genre of music, whether you like it or not, I just use it in this example, is dubstep. So a music that came from South London, from Croydon, that has its roots in reggae and drum and bass and those subcultures, and it broke through the mainstream and became a massively popular genre of music, and started pulling people from the kind of pop music base level of music and culture towards that. So of course when these kind of things happen, when culture is created, the next thing that happens is the music industry or pop music is drawn towards it because they want to feed from that culture creation. And then we're left in a scenario when Britney Spears does a dubstep song and then dubstep is dead. So then dubstep goes back to being at the underground and back to the underbelly of culture, and pop music is back where it was again, mass consuming everything. But essentially what I'm explaining to them is that as graphic designers and as educators we have a role to teach this to our students, that their role in society, their moral role is culture creation. And what you don't want to be is feeding off of culture. You don't want to be like what the pop music industry or the larger music industry does. It feeds from the underground and it takes it over. And there's a constant challenge to recreate and reinvent yourself or your genres or whatever practitioner you are. But essentially I push on to them that Tumblr is pop music. If they're looking at Tumblr for design influence, they're essentially just listening to pop music. They're just taking what's already out there, what everyone knows about, and they're mimicking that. Whereas good design, and the type of design that I try and get my students to produce, it equates to independent music. You're outside of that mass narrative. You are grounded in history. You are grounded in culture. You have an understanding of what came before you, but you're independent. So we need our students to be culture creators and not culture feeders. And this is, really hard to get through to students. I've contemplated banning, Google Image, just because it seems to be the first thing a student does every time they get a project. So as educators, we have a moral obligation to teach the power of graphic design, but we need to align ourselves with commercial institutions. And for me, this is where the teaching of design, the teaching of typography, is where there's real value, where you can access archives and libraries and repositories of knowledge. Because the internet is old media, and what I want to always do with my students is move them away from the internet and move them towards the physical. And I guess in a way, it's like you're saying that you get people out there and engaged and using their hands. James Victor, a New York-based designer, illustrator, said that the social, political stuff, the cultural stuff, that is what graphic design is for. That is it used at its best, not to sell socks. Graphic design is a big fucking club with spikes in it, and I want to wield it. In its pure, in its strongest, in its fullest potential. There's a fantastic documentary that I took this quote from that I always show my first year students. And that's really, for me, the power of design. We can use it, and we can go back to the First Things First manifesto or anyone else's manifesto, and everyone kind of says this, but who actually does it? Who actually teaches design in a way that isn't about doing branding, or it isn't saying, oh, here's a brief for a fake coffee shop that doesn't exist and we want you to do the cups. And for me personally, and I'm not negating or anyone that that does that, but for me that's boring, and also that's the type of work you end up having to do anyway when you're a graphic designer, when you go out and you work in industry. So in education, I think we can be much more inventive, we can do much more interesting work and be much more powerful, and it can be much more powerful for the students, and it helps give them a voice. So I'm just going to show very quickly, I'm going to show two projects that I've done with students, so I'm just not just talking and saying kind of what I believe, that kind of backs up what I'm saying. The first project is a project called Apathy is a Drag, and it was inspired by students' personal experience of activism, subculture and self-organization. It was sharing ways of living, working and collaborating. The group explored print as protest, DIY communities and archives to create a layered text piece. The installation on the hoardings, which I'll show in a second, was built and evolved through the intermittent fly posting throughout the summer. So we worked with an artist called Phoebe Davis, and it was the entire cohort of, this is where I worked in Bristol, the final year students. And they worked with the gallery, the Arnolfini Gallery, which is quite a well-known gallery in Europe. And they produced a body of work that went up in the hoardings over the summer in Bristol. But the beauty of this project was that it was just starting with apathy. So students, I found in my experience are generally quite apathetic. And in the UK, when I was there and there was rising fees and their fees were going up and their student loans were getting outrageous and people were working till they're 40 to pay them off, and students just tended to kind of shrug their shoulders and go, well, that's the way it is. And for me, as graphic designers, we have the tools that are used to control people. We have the tools to tell people to vote for someone. We have the tools to tell people to buy something. And yet, we're the very proponents of those tools, and we have students, certainly in my experience, had an apathetic nature towards this. So we looked at using those tools to bring a message to the people within the city of Bristol, and it was all kind of tied in around the anniversary of punk. So I'll just kind of flick through some of these, and I'll show you them up in the hoardings. And again, I suppose we got across, or here they started thinking about their own kind of power as students, and that versus the academic power, and questioning the value of their education, or certainly the cost of their education underneath a Tory government. And again, looking at things like homelessness within the city. And again, these are very simple things, but they're out on the streets and they have an opportunity to change how someone thinks in their day-to-day. They're not asking someone to, to buy something or do something. They're asking someone to consider themselves in society and the role that they play within society. And like I said, these went up in hoardings around a new building that was being extension that was going on to the gallery, and they developed, and fly posters were put over posters as the time went on. So it was a very simple thing, but it was based in reality. It was based in language. It was based in content, having an understanding of issues that were faced the Bristol area, or students themselves, and understanding almost the culture of dissent or the power of protest, how a simple poster can have an impact on the public. Lawrence Viner said, you find some way to go over it or under it or around it. You don't just stand there and say, okay, I'll join it. And again, that's a massive, massive quote for me, and it comes from the same documentary series by Hillman Curtis that, again, I play to all my first-year students when they come in the first week, to have an understanding of your role and your responsibilities and moral obligation as a communicator, as a graphic designer, that you have control of the tools that are used to control people. And it might sound over the top or a bit big brother-ish, but that is a fact. So when I then coming on to reality, and reality is a state of things as they actually exist, rather than as they may appear or may be imagined. Although, again, going back to what I was saying, a graphic designer, a visual communicator, has the tools to challenge and change and present how things might appear, or could appear, or should appear, or how things are imagined. And we see this, probably the most obvious example of how we see this being done in a propaganda negative way is this guy. Because they use the tools, they use everything a graphic designer used to convince people they're doing, what he's going to do is the right thing. And this guy is a dickhead. I have to say it. Like, it's horrible. It's horrible to even watch. It's a car crash. But that's the reality of modern communication and what it can do. So, graphic design students have a responsibility to use those in ways that look for the betterment of society, to have a responsibility and a moral obligation to the work that they choose to do and they produce. So just, I suppose moving on from Mr. Trump, so the realities of teaching and reality. So my style of teaching, my approach to teaching, my philosophy to teaching is every single project that I set my students is based in reality. It's real, it's based on content, and it's a live project. So I constantly align projects with cultural institutions, with galleries, with museums, with archives, with organizations that have real content and real problems. Now, when I say live, I don't mean that someone pays them at the end of it, and I don't, and sometimes stuff goes into production, sometimes it doesn't. But what it gives our students is an opportunity to work with real content and to work with real people and to go outside the studio and outside their bedrooms and to engage with people, because 80% of being a graphic designer is about just talking to people and conversations and opinions. Jeffrey Zellman said that content precedes design. Design in the absence of content is not design, it's decoration. And this is massively important as well, because I find when my students start that they think to be a graphic designer is you make stuff look cool. And I say to them, yes, by the time you graduate from here, you'll be able to make stuff look cool, but so will every other graduate across the world. What will separate you is what you have to say and how you say it and the content that you deal with. So I'm going to just show one other project which is heavily based on kind of content and typography. Everything I'm talking about, is an underpinning of typography. But I had a project that I ran last year, or just a couple of months ago, in the academic year with my second year students, and students were asked to consider the exhibition in the form of a publication that explored chosen elements and aspects of the Nival archive. Nival is the National Irish Visual Arts Library, and it's a collection, or attempted to collect work from every artist, dead and living, within Ireland. So there's a vast array of content that's in a really old looking kind of archive with big drawers. So the students were asked to to curate, looking at exploration, analysis, selecting, interpreting, and editing and of the archive, and dictated the content and was reflected in the designed outcomes. So there was a challenge there in itself, that I didn't tell them what they were doing. I gave them a perimeter to work within, but it was up to them to find what interests them within the archive. Collaboration was a key aspect of the project, where students worked in teams and liaised with a number of external sources, including artists, designers, and arts organisations. And again, for me, this is a massive thing, to get students outside and to get students talking to people and interviewing people. And the finished publication ended up being every single publication was formally deposited into the Nival archive, for the fact that we're so impressed with it. I have to point out that none of these students, when I started this project with them, when I just joined NCAD, had even used InDesign before. They had no typographic training. So we used this project as a foundation to teach typography and page layout and spacing and everything else that you could kind of think about. And it was done in a 6-week period, which was extremely short. And I had to kind of start, like how you started, with the letter form, the anatomy of type, and into the words, the sentence, the page, the paragraph, the page, and so forth. I'm going to show you just a quick thing, and this is going to skip. And the sound is off. But just after the students produced all these publications, we then had them put on an exhibition. They invited all the artists, or the estates of the artists, that were, so each student had a particular artist or arts organisation or area that they focused on within their publications. So this event was put on, the artists all came around, it got picked up by the national newspapers. I suppose this was the reason it went on, that they inducted all the books into the archive. The amount of learning that the students got from this, not only in book design and layout and typography, but also on how to be an actual designer. And they had to, go out and source printers. They had to bind the book themselves or get binders. They had to go and interview artists who, some were very well-renowned artists in Ireland, and they had to, get used to that situation of speaking to someone that maybe they've looked up to in the past. They had to deal with the archive. They had to negotiate access to the archive. So the only thing that was really given to the students was perimeters to work within, and everything else was left up to them. So there was, for me, it was what mimics a real design brief, a real live brief, because it was actually live and it actually happened. But every aspect that was within it was up to themselves. So there was control, and that sense of control and ownership of content, I feel, in typography and the teaching of typography, is a real driver for students to learn about detailing, because once they have an investment within the content that they're using, and they've went and interviewed someone and they've got the words, it's much easier, I find, to teach them about widows and orphans and what they're doing with text and all the finer detailing points within typography. And some went on to make films based on the books, or that accompanied the books. So I'll just jump. Hold on, that might play. And it's just kind of sample of some of the books and the covers and the different processes used. So at the core of everything I'm saying, and at the core of my teaching practice, is the statement really that typography is a vehicle for knowledge. So in its very kind of face value, it's obvious that typography is a vehicle for knowledge, because typography is how we access knowledge through reading books or content or information. But for me, the teaching of typography is a vehicle for bringing knowledge to students. So if how I teach typography is to focus on content and information, and through that I teach typography. But I suppose the main thing that I do, that I've found lots of other places don't, but that's not to say everyone doesn't, is that the focus on generating your own content in turn makes the teaching of typography more to resonate further with students. So I guess to kind of summarize, and I feel I probably flew through this too fast, the main kind of points that I'm bringing up or I'm suggesting is, can we just call it graphic design and not visual communication? Hands up, graphic design. Very few. Hands up, visual communication. No one. Okay, graphic design wins too. And I'm in the process, actually, I'm the head of department of visual communication. I'm in the process, and it's very long-winded, of changing the name back to graphic design. I think we need to have a recognition that that graphic design is a field rather than a discipline. I think for too long it's been spoken as a discipline, but really it's a vast array of disciplines within a field. I think in the teaching of design there needs to be more alignment with cultural institutions and repositories of knowledge. I think there needs to be a focus on culture creation. I think we need to do work that's grounded in reality and realism. I think in a way we need to restore value in our fields, and by that I mean that the understanding from outside our field, whether it's government or public bodies, of the value of a graphic designer. I'm not a fan of having interns work for 3 months or 2 months or 6 months for free. You wouldn't ask someone who trained as an electrician or a plumber who'd done their 4-year apprenticeship to come and wire your house for free, but yet businesses will ask graphic designer graduates to come and work for free. I also think we maybe need to reinstill even the title graphic designer to get an understanding of the value that's associated with it. If we only look at web designers were getting paid X amount, and when they became UX designers, which is only a name change really, they suddenly were getting paid much more. I think we need to instill a moral responsibility in what it is to be a graphic designer and the tools that you possess and how you use them. And I think all of these and the teaching of design and graphic design itself, I don't believe you can be a good graphic designer without being a good typographer, but a foundation in typography and language is a foundation in history and culture, and that's where we need to build upon. And I think even speaking with yourself earlier that you know, our students grew up in the digital age. Our students are digital natives, where we're digital immigrants. And certainly for me, I find that my students have no interest in web design. They find it boring, but you show them letterpress or you show them ink or screen printing and they run to it. So, you know, there's an innate need and want within them to go back to the history of design and back into the culture of design. And I think that's where we as educators need to start, and not pander to what our deans are telling us that all the jobs are in web design and we all need to have digital courses. Anyway, I'll stop. Thank you.
Not bad for doing it this morning.
I know.
Can we get the lights on a bit so we can